Hello, good morning, everyone. First off, thank you so much for joining us this early in the morning. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to a wonderful discussion. So my name is Drashti Brambant, and I'm a New York City DSA member in the Queens branch. I'll be your moderator today. My organizing for Palestine began undergrad, where I co-led a divestment campaign. And most recently, I was the campaign manager for Ghislaine Kaur, one of our DSA endorsed candidates in City Council here in New York City. We're also joined by two incredible people. So Sumaya is a Palestinian writer and organizer on Palestine, Islamophobia, immigration, and labor. She's currently the director of strategy at the Adullah Justice Project and the co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. She's also a member of New York City DSA. And then we have Olivia, who's the North America coordinator for the Bds Movement. She served as the co-chair of Portland DSA from 2018 to 2021 and helped found DSA's National BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group. She's been involved in many BDS and Palestine solidarity campaigns, as well as labor organizing and anti-fascist and anti-racist organizing in Portland and the broader US context. So our agenda today is as follows. I'm going to be making very brief opening remarks, and then we're going to be asking various questions to Sumaya and Olivia. At the end, we'll have about 15 minutes where you can ask questions using the chat function, and we'll get those questions at the end, and we'll go through them. So I guess I just wanted to start by saying that Palestine is one of the greatest moral issues of our time. You know, in America, including sometimes in our organization, we frame it as purely a humanitarian issue. But it's incumbent upon us especially to note that Palestine is a political issue in which we as Americans are deeply involved in and help propagate, unlike any other country in the world. And that's precisely why, we as DSA adopted a resolution at our national convention in 2017 in support of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS. So in that resolution, there are three big clauses, and I'm going to just read them out briefly. One is that Democratic Social declares its solidarity, Palestinian civil society's nonviolent struggle against apartheid, colonialism, military occupation, and for equality, human rights, and self-determination. 2, Democratic Socialists of America responds to Palestinian civil society's call by fully supporting BDS. And lastly, Democratic Socialists of America affirms that any political solution to the ongoing crisis must be premised on the realization of basic human rights, including all rights outlined in the BDS call. And in 2019, we reaffirmed our commitment to this resolution by creating and establishing the BDS and Palestine Solidarity National Working Group, which Olivia was heavily involved with. We're going to be talking more about that later, but before that, I wanted to bring in one of our panelists to take us a few steps back and kind of explain what is this BDS movement. So Olivia, may I ask you to kind of explain to us, how did this movement come to be? What are its demands, and what specific actions does it call for?
Sure, thank you for that introduction, Drashti. So boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a strategy which was called for by 170 Palestinian civil society organizations in the struggle to achieve freedom, justice, and equality. These tactics of boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning have a really long history in struggles for justice around the world, including in the civil rights movement in the US. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, Israel is occupying and colonizing Palestinian land, discriminating against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and denying Palestinian refugees the right to return to their homes. So the BDS call is inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, and it urges pressure on Israel to comply with international law. So the BDS call was issued by these civil society organizations in 2005, and BDS has now become this huge global movement for Palestinian rights, made up of unions, academic associations, students, churches, and grassroots movements like DSA around the world. BDS utilizes specific nonviolent tactics to address the violence of Israel's system of domination. So the three components of BDS are boycotts, which can include consumer boycotts, like we have a Pillsbury boycott campaign right now because Pillsbury is manufacturing products in an illegal settlement. Cultural boycotts, like a celebrity or artist cancels an appearance in Israel. Sports boycotts, academic boycotts, divestment, so withdrawing investments from corporations involved in Israeli oppression, and sanctions, meaning government sanctions on Israel. And the BDS movement has three clear demands. The first is an end to Israel's occupation of all Arab lands and dismantling of the illegal apartheid wall. The second is full equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the third is the right of return for Palestinian refugees. So there are millions of Palestinian refugees around the world who are not allowed to return to their homes in violation of international law. And the BDS call is not an open-ended boycott of Israel, but it's something that will remain in effect until Palestinian rights are fulfilled. So, you can think of it like a picket line. In DSA, we do a lot of labor organizing, and we would never cross a picket line if workers at a business were on strike. We wouldn't shop there or do business there until their demands were met. And you can think of BDS the same way. The BDS call is based on anti-racist and universal human rights principles. And this is a question we get a lot. The BDS movement does not specify whether the solution should be one state or two state, but rather that any solution must fulfill the basic rights of the Palestinian people in order to be just and sustainable.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for laying that out so thoroughly and providing that analogy. I wanted to ask one follow-up question. So, you mentioned that the BDS movement has gained so much traction. Why do you think so, that it's gained so much traction in the US and abroad?
Yeah, well, first, I think people in the US, at least, are drawn to the issue of Palestine because the United States' support of Israel gives us this unparalleled window into US imperialism and the military-industrial complex. And as socialists, those are things we vehemently oppose, obviously. And BDS is a tangible way that we can oppose that. I think BDS has gained so much traction because it is something actionable we can do. In DSA, we issue a lot of statements standing in solidarity with the different struggles. But it can be hard to figure out how to move beyond just like statements of solidarity or, calling your member of Congress. And BDS is a specific call to action. And it moves people just from, sympathy or symbolic solidarity to tangible action in the form of BDS campaigns. Instead of just being like, that stuff's happening over there, nothing we can really do here. It kind of puts the impetus on all of us to end the ways that our communities are implicated in Israeli violence. And there are a lot you'll find when you do this type of work. So BDS is able to take something that's happening across the world and really localize it so it can't be ignored. It also has a really big educational impact as well. Those of us who have done BDS campaigns before, and even if you've just been watching from the sidelines, you probably know it often creates a lot of controversy that garners a lot of media attention. And it kind of forces people to learn more and take a side on a campaign that directly affects them in your church, in your city, whatever. So even campaigns that might fail to reach their ultimate goal are often a success in building this awareness around Palestine. And, we also do BDS because it works. So not just bringing media attention, not just education, there's been a snowball of BDS victories with actual economic and political impacts. And as socialists, using this sort of lens of who is profiting from this violence is really helpful when applied to so many other aspects of our work as well.
Got it. Thanks so much, Olivia. And that provides, the perfect segue because I want to kind of talk about what those victories are and how one can actually go beyond a statement of solidarity. So, Sumaya, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the current state of U.S. organizing around BDS in Palestine. What are the victories that Olivia has mentioned, and how can local organizers engage in this type of work?
Thanks, Drashti. Thanks, Olivia, for laying that out. So I think with BDS and really with any movement, it's really important to start by laying out how we measure success, because oftentimes it's not as simple as, this campaign happened and it won or it didn't, or this company divested or this campus actually divested its money. But with BDS, I would say there's ways to measure success. The first is shift in public opinion, right? So for decades, Israel has been using propaganda, along, of course, with the US government, to make it so that you couldn't talk about Palestine without being accused of anti-Semitism in one way or another. And so decades of fighting against this propaganda and shifting public perception of Israel, I think that's one way to measure the success. So the ways that BDS campaigns, I think specifically for this, the campus movements, student divestment movements, so there are dozens of campuses across the US that have passed divestment resolutions. Those resolutions haven't led to an actual divestment of university funds from Israel. What they have done is this massive shift in consciousness and have really politicized student bodies, generation after generation after generation. And that's what we're seeing today with the polls that have come out in the last few years that show increasingly young Americans are actually critical of Israel. There was a poll that was released just a couple months ago. It was a poll of American Jews, and it found that I think it was like a quarter of them called Israel an apartheid state. 22% said Israel was committing genocide. So these shifts in public perception are huge and are the foundation of any sort of material impact that BDS and the Palestine movement can have. So that's the first set of successes, I would say. And then the other is the material impact. And we're starting to see more of that now, like in the last 10 years, and I think especially in the last 5, where you see companies actually divest because there's so much pressure applied on them that they realize they're going to lose profit if they continue to do this. And there are many, many examples. The most recent one that kind of made headlines was Ben & Jerry's choosing to pull out of the settlements. In some ways, this was a symbolic victory, but it's going to lead to Ben & Jerry's pulling out of Israel entirely. That's sort of like the expected next step that will happen by the end of the year. And this was massive. And you know that their successes because you see the response from Israel, right? From the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the really intense attack on the Palestine movement when any of these wins occur. There's also a lot of other ways I think that we can other things we can point to. So for example, the fact that one of the largest movements in the US, Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, has a public, in their public platform in 2017, very explicitly said they support Palestine and BDS, and referred to Israel as an apartheid state. That's incredibly important. The fact that increasingly no one can really say that they're on the left or progressive, broadly defined, without having a stance on Israel. And then, of course, the fact that, in Congress, in US Congress, where Palestinians are least heard, right, where our demands are least heard or often just silenced or persecuted, that we have sitting members of Congress that are championing, to various degrees, the call for Palestinian liberation. And even more specifically, BDS. A couple of years ago, you couldn't talk about BDS in any sort of public arena, whether it was in the media or on campus, without being ostracized completely. And that's just not the case anymore. The battle of ideas is actually right now skewed in favor of the Palestine movement. And I think it's because, you asked Olivia earlier, why is there so much traction around BDS? I don't think it's a coincidence that BDS really took off and that Palestine is increasingly incorporated into the left in the US broadly defined, and of course the socialist left as well, at around the same time that so many other movements are growing, right? Immigrant rights, Medicare for all, climate justice, they're all growing together because it's seen as part of one platform. And people are connecting the dots because, class consciousness is shifting. And I think that's tremendously important to point to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sumaya. I asked you about the victories, but I must also ask you about the challenges that organizers face. So can you discuss a little bit and share a little bit about, instances of, censorship or harassment that organizers have faced, and kind of why these attacks are taking place, but also maybe why they can't, and will never silence the BDS movement.
Definitely. I could talk about this for hours. I'm going to try to keep it to a few minutes. A lot of people have described the attack on the Palestine movement and on BDS as the latest incarnation of McCarthyism. And I think that's completely true. The blacklists, the smear campaigns, people being deported for their Palestine advocacy, harassment, isolation, etc. It really is all reminiscent of what communists faced in the US in the 50s. There's a lot of examples to point to. I'll focus on three. The first is the blacklists. So the most famous one is Canary Mission. So there are these online blacklists that often target the most vulnerable in the Palestine movement, and that actually really took off when BDS started to be popular in the US on college campuses, which is one of its strongholds in the US. BDS was on college campuses. And so they targeted students, and it would be these anonymous, people would submit names anonymously and information, and it would be a profile, someone's profile up there, their photo, screenshots of social media, connections they have, like what networks they're in. And of course, every single person would be labeled a terrorist sympathizer. And there's documented proof that Canary Mission has been used by the Israeli government to prohibit Palestinians from returning home, or Palestine solidarity activists from entering, but also that the FBI has used it in cases. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to say that it's all of the blacklist, the smear campaigns, the persecution of Palestine solidarity activists. All of the tactics they use also rely heavily on the post 9/11 war on terror rhetoric and Islamophobia that allows the U.S. government and Israel to get away with attacking people's First Amendment rights, with deporting people, with messing around people's immigration status because of their work on Palestine. And that would have been possible before 9/11, but 9/11 really allowed it to go on unjustified. And it's important to think about this because we're approaching the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. But so one is blacklists. SJP chapters on college campuses, have faced outright bans, had funding withheld, events canceled. Members were asked to attend civility and dialogue trainings, or they were told that they could only speak about Palestine in free speech zones. So things like that. And then, of course, there are anti-boycott laws enacted in the US in 30 different states. There are 221 bills introduced to censor Palestine advocacy in these states, and 22% of them have passed. And we're actually expecting that to go up, especially after the Ben and Jerry's campaign was announced a few weeks ago. The Israeli ambassador to the US said that he wants to meet with all of the states that don't have anti-boycott laws and those that do to ensure that they include Ben and Jerry's in their anti-boycott laws. So it's a really disproportionate response to a movement that Israel claims has no impact, right? Israel keeps saying like, oh, BDS is not going to work. And even critics of BDS say like, BDS is not the way to go if you want to hold Israel accountable. And yet there's this disproportionate response with billions of dollars funding it against, a student movement, a grassroots movement.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sumaya. I'm glad that you and Olivia kind of laid out what exactly the BDS movement is, what's the current state of organizing, and as well as some of those victories and challenges. I want to kind of shift gears at the moment to ask both of you a key question as it relates to DSA. Given what we just talked about, why is it that, we as socialists must support Palestine? How does this fight for Palestine fit into our socialist movement? And also, where do you think the DSA membership at large is kind of at right now with organizing around Palestine? So Olivia, let's start with you, and then we'll go back to Sumaya.
Sure. So as socialists, we are working to build a working class organization. We focus on organizing the working class. And this is very much a working class issue. And we know that workers have a lot of power to stop the United States' support of Israel. For example, after the most recent escalation of violence by Israel in May, there was a wave of worker actions. Workers stood in solidarity with picket lines blocking the Israeli Zim ship in Oakland, in South Africa, in Canada, in New Jersey. Italian dock workers refused to load a ship that was headed for Israel. This is direct action taken by workers. And that's huge. And I think we need to see more of that. And I think we will see more of that. Multiple teachers unions in the US have endorsed BDS and called for an end to military funding to Israel just this summer, which until now has been unprecedented in the US because of that repression that Sumaya was talking about. So as we work in DSA to organize the working class, we also have to ensure that this support for Palestine is built into that. Which it is. As Sumaya mentioned, poll after poll shows that the majority of Americans support Palestinian rights and do not support the violence that Israel is committing. And the problem, as always, is that we are unorganized. So the more we get organized as the working class, the better chance we have at moving these demands as the working class. And we're also seeing that reflected at the top levels of our working class organization now, with Cori Bush, for example, coming from a working class background and a background as an activist in Ferguson, now bringing her unapologetic support for BDS to the halls of Congress. I think we're just getting started. And I think there's a lot of sort of issue-based left-wing organizations in the US that support Palestine and BDS. But DSA is uniquely positioned because we're essentially a pre-party organization. We're not a party, but we're sort of laying the foundation, and we very much act like a party in a lot of ways. And so we're really uniquely positioned to enact BDS at different levels in this country. Really quick in terms of like the membership, we know DSA endorsed BDS overwhelmingly in 2017. And I think that the vast majority of members now in 2021 still very much support that position. But supporting it and enacting it are two different things. I would love to see more active BDS organizing in DSA chapters, though there's definitely, a lot going on already. I also think we need to have it more baked into our culture, just like the way that Medicare for All and a Green New Deal and other organizational priorities are. So even if it isn't something you actively organize on yourself, you're viewing the work you do organize on through this lens. You always have solidarity with Palestine. That's something you won't compromise on. And we absolutely need to see that with our candidates as well. We should not be putting forward candidates that are not supportive of BDS because that goes against our position as an organization. And I think that is something we could improve on as an organization.
Thank you, Olivia. And now, Sumaya, I ask you those same questions.
Yeah. I think on a very basic level, if as socialists, what we're up against is capitalism. And in the US, against global capitalism, but in the US, against US capital. And if we really want to do that, it means going up against US militarism. You can't separate the two, right? The US is the world's largest empire. There are 400 military bases around the world. And if we want to go up against US imperialism, against militarism, we have to be able to have a strong stance on Israel and a movement that can hold Israel accountable and end its apartheid regime, its settler colonial project. And not in sort of like a detached solidaristic way, but there's an organic connection between what we're doing here and what is happening there, right? Between what the US government is doing and big business is doing here and what is happening in Palestine. And that's why the US constantly diverts any attempt to hold Israel accountable for its atrocities, right? And its war crimes. Just in April, Israel was accused by the Human Rights Watch of crimes against humanity. And it's not like we didn't know that it had done that before, but the fact that that was put out in this official report and everything, and still a month later you had the Biden saying, no, we need to keep giving them funding, even as they're carpet bombing Gaza, really shows that. And so Israel's role in global surveillance, in the weapons industry globally, right? It leads in security technology. It's the world's largest arms supplier per capita. All of that has an impact on what happens here, right? On increased militarism in the US, but also in other countries around the world. And of course, you can't separate that from the rise of the right, right? And the flip side of that, the rise of the left. And the military funding that the US gives Israel every year, $3.8 billion, there's actually a clause in there that necessitates that a certain percentage of this funding Israel has to spend on purchasing US weapons, right? So this is actually actively also growing the US arms industry. And it really kind of brings home the point that you can't separate foreign policy from domestic policy. They're not two different areas of work. They're actually very, very connected. And then just like very briefly, the question of why the US is so interested in what's happening in Israel, obviously the excuses they give is that it's necessary because it's part of the fight against anti-Semitism. And we know that that's just not the case. And I won't go into it here, but there are many examples of why that's not true. But what is true and why it is interested is for geopolitical and business interests, right? The US is trying to establish a single economic zone across the Middle East, and Israel is key to that, as are the Gulf countries. That's why the normalization deals happened. And that means that as socialists, we're also fighting against neoliberalism, right? That's part of what we're doing. We're fighting against privatization. And this entire project that the US has in the Middle East, the single economic zone that Israel is very much a part of, is all about solidifying and cementing the privatization of all sorts of industries across the Middle East. And we've actually already seen this start to happen. And so, separate from why to support it on sort of a moral and ethical stance, it's also like part of what it means to go up against capitalism. Olivia mentioned this about, what we're trying to do is build a working class movement, right? That's what binds us together. And that goes beyond borders, that we're building a new kind of world, a new system. And to do that, we have to be able to stand with the oppressed beyond our borders. And for Palestine in particular, that does mean heeding the call for BDS. Like, that's what Palestinians are calling for. They're saying, hey, you want to support us? Then we need you to implement BDS. They're not saying go do some vague thing. They're saying this is what you should do. And it's Palestinians on the ground, right? It's not any party or faction. And I think that's really, really key and important, and actually pretty unique to Palestine right now. When you think of some of the other things that are happening, there isn't such a direct call. I really want to sort of cement something Olivia said, that what this means is not adding Palestine, not adding BDS as like a component of our platform, right? We've kind of already done that, but really realizing that it's an area of work that we can have a real impact in, right? As socialists, not some other group on the left, but us as DSA, as socialists, and not in an abstract way, and certainly not down the line, but right now, that we're at this critical juncture where there's this massive opportunity to leverage our power and our influence to heed this call from Palestinians. And at a crucial time where Israel is just expanding further and further into Palestinian land, and continuing its atrocities unchecked, right? That's what we saw happen in May. And so that this is a very critical time to do this. It's not something that can wait until down the line. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Olivia and Sumaya, for so clearly laying out why this cause is imperative for us as socialists. I want to ask you, before we move on to the question of how one can get involved, how specifically you both have seen DSA interweave this commitment to BDS in Palestine in our work. So maybe Olivia, if you can talk a little bit about Portland DSA, and then Sumaya about kind of the New York City scene with the city council, with the congressional levels, Iran, everyone. But Olivia, over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So in Portland DSA, we've worked on a number of BDS initiatives. We very much have BDS as an uncompromising position of our chapter. We make sure it's in all our candidate questionnaires, et cetera. But my favorite campaign that we did was a campaign we did in 2018 to get our NBA team, the Portland Trailblazers, to drop the sniper scope company Leupold and Stevens. There would be a segment during Blazers games called Hometown Hero, where they would honor a hometown hero, mostly police and military. And it was sponsored by this company, Leupold and Stevens, which makes hunting equipment, but also military equipment. And they supply sniper scopes to the Israeli army. So when the Great March of Return was happening in 2018, and thousands of Palestinians were being shot by snipers, you could see in the photos this loopholed L logo on the sniper scopes. And that same logo was all over the Blazers stadium during this Hometown Hero segment. And the honoree would receive a loopholed goodie bag with binoculars and stuff in it. So we started this campaign just by having a press conference during a community basketball tournament that was hosted by the Blazers, just to really inform the community about this sponsorship and what was happening. And we got a lot of really positive feedback from Blazers fans, like, wow, this is really messed up. Why do they have this partnership? The kind of cool thing about the campaign was that we were reaching a set of people, basketball fans, that aren't normally hearing about Palestine, and just educating them on the issue. And they were very open to it. So we flyered at games. We went to Media Day, and a reporter actually asked about it during Media Day, which put the Blazers on the spot, and they were no longer able to ignore it. But our biggest action was when we actually got a DSA comrade who was a Marine nominated for Hometown Hero. And when he was recognized at the game on TV, thousands of people were watching, he unzipped his sweatshirt and his shirt said, "End this sponsorship, #NoLoophole." He took a knee and refused the goodie bag. And so that made international news. Everyone was freaking out about it. And it drew way more attention to this campaign and put the Blazers in this really tough spot with everyone asking, yeah, why do you have this partnership? Wow, you have a veteran protesting you? That's pretty bad. So the next season at Media Day, they were forced to announce that the Blazers and Loophole had ended their partnership together. And that was an amazing win for us. And I think a really great example of how localized these kinds of BDS campaigns can be, and how you can sort of get creative with them. And how you can do campaigns with these secondary targets. So a weapons company in your town is probably not going to stop selling weapons because that's what they do. But you can target ties that they may have in your community institutions.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Wow. Sumaya, over to you.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite BDS campaigns. I'm also a big NBA fan. So yeah, many examples. I'll give the example in New York that's kind of ongoing. So New York, Cuomo, who I'm sure everyone now knows about because he's soon going to be impeached, inshallah. He in 2016 he passed an executive order. He signed an executive order basically directing New York State to keep a public register of all organizations involved in boycotts of Israel. The idea was that the order basically mandated that all state agencies, any public agency under his authority, would not be able to get funding if they boycotted Israel. And there's a number of other similar resolutions in New York State that haven't passed that would sort of limit this even more. Anyway, so there's been pushback for a while, but I think one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years, and that's really important, is local and state elections and candidates, many of them DSA, that have either been persuaded to support BDS or come out publicly in support, or who already did, and that was actually part of their platform when they ran. And I think this has everything to do with the rise of BDS in the last 10 years in particular, and the campaigns and sort of the shift in public consciousness, so that people didn't need to be afraid to say what they thought and what they believed, right? Because a lot of people do know that what Israel's doing is wrong. It doesn't take rocket science to be like apartheid is wrong, right? Settler colonialism is wrong. They're definitely not two equal sides. But to actually feel confident enough and to feel that there is a movement backing them to speak up about it. But also that there's an organization like DSA that can proudly have candidates on the local level that support BDS and that champion BDS, and then unabashedly, right, unconditionally. And I think one of the best examples of this is Zohran Mamdani in New York, right? New York State Assembly member Zohran Mamdani, who actually was politicized around Palestine. And when he was running, BDS was part of his platform. And he openly and confidently talked about it, and he won. And he's continuing to do so even now within the New York State Assembly. And there's rumblings of ways to reverse the executive order, which I won't go into right now. But I think the importance of the local elections is actually really key. Often we just focus on the congressional races, which are of course important, and Cori Bush and AOC are examples of that. But the local elections are also just as important, if not more important, depending on their context. And I think being strategic about thinking about, how do we bring BDS to people we're considering endorsing, whether they know about it already and need to be nudged to speak about it. How do we apply pressure in the right way? And it's a lot of strategic conversations to think about. But I think increasingly it's becoming easy to do that, and that we really need to incorporate that into our electoral strategy, especially on the local level, because that's what ends up growing to have an impact on the congressional races. And I think Zahoran is one very good example of that.
Thank you so much, Sumaya. So clearly, there's various ways in which, we as socialists can kind of interweave this work, whether that's like in the sports realm or legislation or whatever it may be. I want to kind of talk about, before we move on to the last part of this panel, internal organizing that one can do in DSA to kind of further the movement and further the cause within our own organizing. So, Olivia and others will talk more about the BDS national working group that we have. But one thing that I want to mention before that we kind of concretely did was the Education Electoral Committee created these 2 guides. One for electoral working groups all across the country, and one for DSA endorsed candidates across the country. So the former was a guide of what questions to ask for candidates seeking our endorsement. And this was a unique opportunity to kind of ask and highlight the importance of these questions, right? So if a candidate comes to you and says, I support Medicare for all, great. If they say they don't, it's kind of an immediate red flag, and you're kind of tossing their questionnaire out of the window, like in that sense. And so we wanted to make sure that BDS, as Olivia mentioned earlier, is just as important in our vision, in our socialist movement, as Medicare for all is. So one question, that we made a list of questions for every level of office, for the congressional level, state level, local level, of kind of modifying them as they relate to that specific office, but making sure that on everyone, we very point blank ask, do you support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions? And this guide is meant to kind of offer each and every electoral working group the specific language and specific, stances that our BDS national working group has to kind of guide the working group in assessing their candidates. And the second guide we kind of created was for endorsed candidates that first offered a short 2-page primer on what Palestine, Israel, and BDS, what it all entails as it relates to our organization, because we know that many come with uneven levels of knowledge on the issue. So we kind of have that primer. We also have these responses to typical bad faith questions, always thrown, not only at our candidates, but literally anyone on working to advance Palestinian rights, as well as actions that our candidates can concretely take, like Sumaya had mentioned about Zahoran. What are actions you can take whilst on the campaign trail, whilst in office as well as these whole list of resources. So that's all to say that there's a lot of stuff that we can do, externally as DSA, but also internally to make sure our membership is really connected to that resolution we passed in 2017 that says we fully support BDS, not only in words, but in actions as well. So now I want to kind of, in our last 10 minutes before the Q&A, I want to ask us 3 to kind of elaborate a little bit more on how a DSA member can get involved in like DSA organizing around Palestine. So I want to pass it off to Olivia first to kind of explain how the working group works, as well as its subcommittees.
Yeah, I think if you want to get involved at the national level, the best way is to join the working group, the BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group. We have Palestine liaisons, meaning, a liaison to represent the working group in your chapter. We can help you start a BDS subcommittee or working group in your chapter. We have a couple different subcommittees in our working group. Our working group is led by, I think, a 10-person steering committee. I'm not one of those members. I think, Drashti, are you still on the steering committee?
I'm currently not.
Oh, okay. Well, we have an amazing steering committee. And we have a couple different subcommittees. The BDS campaign subcommittee is one of them that's just working on, direct BDS campaigning and helping support people in chapters doing that campaigning. The Electoral and Education subcommittee, which is the committee that has put on political education events, and it has also put together the great resources that Drashti was talking about for DSA candidates and elected officials, and also just making sure that our organization is holding to its BDS stance across the board and has the support to be able to do that. And then we also have a recruitment subcommittee that's both recruiting people to the working group inside DSA and also recruiting Palestinian BDS organizers outside of DSA into DSA. So it's a really great sort of centralized hub to get involved in this work in DSA and then also take it back to your chapter.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. Sumaya, did you want to expand on the Palestine Liaisons program?
I'll just say that I think if someone's interested in doing this work and they feel like it's not already happening in their chapter and you want to sort of figure out how to do that, apply to become a liaison, because that's a very good first step and sort of just seeing like what could that look like, but also connecting with all the other people, all the other chapters across the country that do have a liaison, sort of strategizing together across the board. I also just want to add one other thing that I think is really important, especially for people doing labor organizing, which is that, I think the labor movement in the US is very weak, but also growing right now. And that's very exciting. And I think on a grassroots level, we should push for more efforts to bring Palestine into our labor organizing. There's a history of that, a long history of that. And I think that the recent actions to block shipments of Israeli weaponry, the Zim actions that have been taking place are really an inspiration, sort of show the power of organized workers to bring change on this particular matter, right? And generally on US foreign policy. And I also just want to sort of emphasize that to build the type of Palestine movement we really need, we're going to have to integrate Palestine and other international struggles into our labor organizing. And I don't think that in particular is a short-term plan, but I think it should be part of a long-term strategic priority when we're thinking about what should our labor organizing be and how should we prioritize it in DSA.
Thank you so much. So far, we kind of talked about you can get involved in our national working group, you can become a Palestine liaison to kind of connect the working group with your local chapter. I also want to give one last thing, which is super, super exciting. So we're going to have a BDS summer school. It's going to be a space for not only education, discussion, but actual mobilization to kind of go out and start that organizing for Palestinian liberation through BDS. No, you don't need any organizing experience or any, prior knowledge to kind of join the summer school. It's exactly for that. So it's going to be starting August 21st, and there are 5 sessions each week on a Saturday that goes through introducing what BDS is, detailing those example successes of specific boycotts and divestment movements, as well as talking about BDS and the working class. So it's really an amazing opportunity to learn more in depth with people. And, there's mobilization sessions weaved into that to kind of actually do something and not only just take in this information. So I'll be dropping all these links in the chat in just a second. But now I kind of want to move into our Q&A portion. We've gotten some questions for Olivia and Sumaya. So I'll be asking the first one, which is, and Olivia and Sumaya, feel free, either of you, to both answer it or go in whichever order. The first question is, do you think Israel's reaction to Ben and Jerry's helped or hurt the BDS movement? Is their state strategy having any effect?
I can jump in. I think it's very telling to see such a strong response from Israel in responding to Ben and Jerry's decision to withdraw from selling in the settlements. I think it's because they're terrified that Ben and Jerry's is now paving the way for other US corporations and institutions to follow their lead. And that is why the response is so strong. You know, it's really troubling that we're seeing Israeli officials trying to push US lawmakers to, you know, push these measures that suppress people's free speech and their right to engage in nonviolent action. But we've also seen courts in Texas, Maryland, Arkansas have overturned these anti-BDS state laws. So I think as much as Israel and US lawmakers are trying to push these anti-BDS measures, I don't think they'll succeed. And I do think they will pave the way for other companies to follow suit. The UN Human Rights Council published a database in 2020 of 112 companies complicit in business activities in illegal Israeli settlements. And General Mills is one of those companies on this database, because of its activities with Pillsbury. Pillsbury is owned by General Mills, which produces Pillsbury products in a factory in the Atarat Industrial Zone, which is an illegal settlement. And even the Pillsbury family, Charlie Pillsbury and several of his family members who no longer have control over the company, have called for a boycott of Pillsbury products until they stop this manufacturing in the Atarat Industrial Zone and remain complicit with violations of international law. So I think it would be amazing to see General Mills follow in Ben and Jerry's footsteps on this, and as well as the other 112 companies on this UN database. And I think if Ben and Jerry's sticks with their decision, which I think that they have to now, I don't think there's any putting the toothpaste back into the tube. Like, I think they have to stick with it now. It will pave the way for others to follow.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I also think that it's sort of a reminder of how a campaign can seem small and futile at the start, because you're up against really massive corporations with lots of funding, and you're also up against the Israeli government, which has no problem dumping billions and billions of dollars into fighting against very small campaigns run by students, run by volunteers, run by grassroots organizers. But the Ben and Jerry's campaign, which started over a decade ago, is a good reminder of what it takes, and also just how much the movement is growing, and how we are winning the argument, right? Israel is not able to just continue saying it's the victim when it's very, very clearly not, right? When it's very clearly not two equal sides. So I think in that sense, it has been a major win. And that, you know, as Palestinians, what we're really hoping is that by the end of the year, they do pull out fully out of Israel, you know, out of 48 as well. That's their plan, and that's the hope. And I think it will pressure other corporations to do the same.
Yeah, and so the next question is about what's the state of vaccination in Palestine, specifically in Gaza? And maybe this is an opportunity for you both to talk a little bit about kind of how that demonstrates, or how that specific example demonstrates a larger picture of apartheid.
Yeah, I can start. So I don't have the exact numbers for what it's like in Gaza right now. I know that if you go online to, I think it's the WHO that's monitoring the exact numbers. What I can say is that it is a very small amount of people that have been vaccinated in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And that is all by design, that Israel has the vaccines to vaccinate all Palestinians, and does not, which is no surprise because of its apartheid regime, right? When you have Jewish-only roads and Jewish-only settlements and Jewish-only neighborhoods, hospitals and schools where Palestinians are not allowed, parks, places where you're not allowed to build homes if you're Palestinian or own property, it's actually not a big surprise that Palestinians are not going to be vaccinated. So that's sort of my short answer. But I also think it's kind of like an important reminder of, or actually what I'll say is, in May, when Gaza was being carpet bombed, the first thing on people's mind wasn't the vaccine, right? It was that I'm under an occupation that can kill me any day, any minute, at any time. And not just for Palestinians in Gaza, but also Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, where a couple of weeks ago, a Palestinian kid was killed. It was like every 3 days, one Palestinian after another was killed, and they were all children, doing very normal things like grocery shopping or in a car with their parents. And so I think it's the vaccine apartheid is part of that, but it's also just one piece of the larger puzzle of occupation and settler colonialism that needs to end and that the U.S. is funding.
Thank you.
I'll just add, Yumna Patel, who writes for Mondoweiss, does a really good COVID bulletin newsletter article every week on just what's happening with COVID and vaccines in Palestine. So if you want more in-depth coverage of that, you should check that out.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. So we have 2 more questions left. The next one is, several DSA chapters in Connecticut are part of the effort to stop Ruger guns from being sold to Israel, since thousands have been shot by Rugers in the West Bank and Gaza. What can be done to dramatize this while the country is still suffering from COVID?
Yeah, I would just really compare this to the example that I talked about that we did in Portland with Leupold and Stevens. It was a really long shot to get Leupold to not sell their supplies to the Israeli army, because that's what they do, that's why they exist. But it was feasible to pressure this high profile secondary target of this partnership with the Blazers and Leupold. And so I think if you can look for secondary targets, places that Ruger is sponsoring stuff in the community, because they do try and do this kind of stuff to improve their public image. I think that is a great way to raise awareness of the campaign and to put that extra pressure on Ruger.
Great. 2 other questions, actually. So the next question is, someone said that my union passed a BDS resolution in June, and it has caused a huge uproar. Our union leaders are now dialing the resolution back, and there's even talk of rescinding it. How do we stand against such liberal hand-wringing?
Great question. Refuse to let them do that. Organize your union members to sign on to a letter saying we don't want to rescind this, we refuse rescinding this. This goes against everything we stand for as workers, and this is actually part of our fight for our own rights and building a workers' movement in the US. And also just very simply, this is what unions are for, right? Unions are political, they're inherently political. And this is an extension of that, right? As a stand against oppression. So I'd say really organizing the people in your union that are sympathetic and figuring out who's not and how they need to be convinced is key. And also getting in touch with other unions that have passed resolutions. Many of them have also, even if they haven't said it publicly, have received a lot of pushback internally. Things like this, I hear all the time. So getting a sense from them what worked in pushing back against union leadership's attempts to dilute resolutions or rescind them.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think political education goes a really long way. So even though, it might have been better to do this before the resolution was voted on, I think if you can do some sort of internal panel or talk and invite union members who don't really know that much about, this fight that's going on, and educate them on Palestine and why the union has taken this stance, and give them the examples of the other unions that have taken this stance, I think that would go a long way.
Thank you. And now the last question for you both. There's an organization name in this that I might mispronounce, so excuse me if I do so. What do the panelists think the best way to pressure organizations like Ateret Kohanim that have tax-exempt status in the US? And so this organization, for those who may not know, is an organization that actively works to create a Jewish majority in East Jerusalem.
So there's an ongoing campaign against this. It is just not yet public. But if the person who asked wants to reach out to talk about how to get involved, please do. But I think there's a number of ways to apply pressure, some of them through elected bodies in the states, in New York State Assembly and City Council, and others through grassroots direct action.
Cool. So thank you so much, everyone, for being with us today at this very early morning panel. I'm sure folks on the West Coast like Olivia are like, but thank you again. And please remember that there are 3 really concrete and important ways to get involved with BDS in Palestine organizing in DSA, which is, the working group that Olivia talked about, the specific Palestine liaisons program that Sumaya talked about, as well as the BDS Summer School, which is starting very soon. So please make sure to sign up and reserve your spot. I just want to turn it over to Olivia and Sumaya to see if you all wanted to add anything, since we have about 3 minutes left.
I don't really have anything to add. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And yeah, please get involved in the working group. We'd love to have you.
Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks Olivia and Drashti for moderating. I mean, I'll just say that I think that we can win. I think we can win Palestinian liberation. I think that all the work, decades and decades of Palestinians resisting and decades of this movement in the US growing, and now that there's a real left in the US again, and a socialist left, it's possible. So don't dilly-dally, people. Don't just be like, okay, I'm just going to go back to what I'm doing. Figure out how to incorporate Palestine into what you're organizing, how you're organizing. And if you don't know how, there's a working group that you can talk to, filled with all these people. So there's a way. The time is really now. It's urgent. When you look at what's happening in Palestine, you can tell it is urgent, and that we have this opportunity right now, and we're not going to have it for very long. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sumaya and Olivia. Really, really appreciate you both being on the panel. And thank you everyone who has been listening and watching this panel. Bye, everyone.